But we are in a want for fathers. And I don't mean we're in a want for people that can parent children. We are in a want for people who provide and protect. And when I say fathers, you could go ahead and call it mothers as too. Because, by the way, I don't think that God puts some sort of exclusive thing simply on fatherhood. I believe that God shows himself as a mother as well. But because the society into which Jesus came hasn't changed much today, that society was very patriarchal. So at the top of the pyramid of power sat fatherhood. And that fatherhood then sort of filtrates its way down into every system, whether it was government or the church, religion, what have you. And so there's a want, not for a patriarchal society, we already have that. There's a want for a fatherhood that loves and embraces. And it's why the need to tell people about father's love has become so crucial, because people need some figure in order to receive the love. Their love and their concern and their protection. I think that that's why seeing God as Father becomes so crucial, because then people have a father, whether they have an earthly father or not. I want to start with what I think out of the blocks looks like a contradiction. And you've heard me do this before. I'll put up a text and then I'll put up another one and go, look, they look opposite. I don't do that to undermine your confidence in the scriptures at all. I think it's actually the opposite. Sometimes I do it to show you that what appear sometimes to be contradictions are in fact talking about two different contexts. But when you really get serious at looking at those and you don't just overlook them, because sometimes what we do with them is go, I don't know, I don't understand it. We just move on. That's not the way to get to the bottom of things. When we start to take them serious and we don't just brush them aside, we start to get into the heart of what's really going on in that text. So I want to stack a couple of them up at the beginning here. One from Paul, one from Jesus. Spoiler alert, should never be a shocker that Paul and Jesus sometimes look like they're coming at different angles. Because they are. Oftentimes they're coming at the same thing from a different angle, but they're also coming one on one side of the cross and one on the other. And so we want to try to find some symmetry between these. Let's start with Paul. 1 Corinthians 4, 14, 15, 16. I do not write these things to shame you, but as my beloved children, I warn you, for though you might have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet you do not have many fathers. In Christ Jesus, I have begotten you through the gospel. Therefore, I urge you, imitate me. Now, what I do with this a lot of times is end up with Paul saying, imitate me, which is a little ironic because he just told them one chapter earlier, don't follow any of us. And then he can't help himself. Now it's like, oh, well, if you're going to follow somebody, follow me. Kind of classic Paul. But I don't want to land there today. That's there. Urge you to imitate me. But I do want to look at 15. You might have 10,000 instructors, which seems hyperbole. You know, nobody has 10,000 instructors. This is our first indication that Paul is certainly not trying to lay out some sort of theology. You might have 10,000 instructors, but you don't have many fathers. But I've begotten you, which is another way of saying, I'm your father. If I've begotten you, I'm your dad, right? I have birthed you, I'm your father. So what does Paul really say to the Corinthian church? You got a lot of people teaching you a lot of things. You got them telling you how to do things, how to have church, who you are, etc., etc. They're instructors, but they're not your father. An instructor is who you go to school with. Your father is who birthed you. Paul leaves no doubt who he thinks their daddy is. Notice, he doesn't point to God, he points to himself. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that Paul thinks that God's not their father? Well, no, because we know the body of Paul's work. So he most definitely knows that they are that God is their spiritual father. But Paul, without a doubt, declares himself to be their father. Stack that up against this by Jesus in Matthew 23:9. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father, he who is in heaven. Pretty straightforward. Don't call anybody else your father. You already have one. He lives in the realm of the heavenlies. In other words, the only father that deserves the title father is the father you can't see. That's why he says in heaven, not on earth. Now, every one of us have a father, whether you know him or not, whether he's alive or not. You had someone that fathered you, and therefore you had an earthly father. So at some point there was someone that you could call your earthly father. And so the question then, to me, is twofold. One, is Paul contradicting Jesus? Because Paul goes, I'm your father. Jesus said, don't call anybody your father. Puts the Corinthians in a bit of a bind. And then the second thing I think that's important is, does Jesus mean you can't call your dad dad? Now, I don't want to make a mountain out of two molehills because, what's the matter at the end of the day? It really doesn't, quite frankly, because the reality is that we all know we have a dad. Whether you're allowed to call him dad or not, you're going to call him something, and dad doesn't like to be called by his first name. So you and him need to work that out. So whether Jesus told you could or not, that's in your house, that's your thing. So don't think that's some sort of spiritually pressing matter. And quite frankly, I don't think Paul's contradicting Jesus. I think that Paul believes he has birthed into the faith the Corinthian people, introduced them to the gospel, and that no one else has. And I think it's Paul's way of saying, if you're going to listen to 10,000 people, let me be the one that you listen to the most, because I put something in and I invested something into your life. In Jesus' case, call no man father, definitely comes near in verse 9, so we know there's stuff in front of it. 23 is a long chapter, so we know there's stuff after it. We'll dig into the context in a moment. But I don't think this has much to do with calling your dad dad and your mom mom. I think it has to do with something far deeper, something below the surface. And here's why. Because I want to show you a couple of passages in the Gospels where Jesus blatantly leaves out the Father in a story in which he could include the Father. Now, before I do that, I want you to realize that I do realize that Jesus uses dads in stories. The prodigal son is probably the most famous story of a father and his two sons. So it's not as if Jesus doesn't recognize that there are fathers. But Jesus goes to extra special lengths to drop them from certain narratives, and I want to find out why.